Welcome to this session. My name is Dora Papatheochari. I am an assistant professor at the University of Thessaly in Greece, and that is a partner in this very beautiful sustainable tourism mission. So the topic of this session is very important to us because tourism actually thrives because of nature, because of natural resources. And what would happen without them? What would happen without natural resources? What would happen to the sector? The wildlife, the ecosystems, the landscapes, they all inspire people to explore, to connect, to live experiences in the Mediterranean tourism destinations, but also around the world. So I guess we could say that nature is actually the best tourist agent, travel agent that nature is the best travel agent that tourists could have. Well, minus the commission. So nature doesn't ask for any commission. So in this session, we will have the presentation of one of our thematic papers that is focusing on the institutionalization of biodiversity and sustainable tourism practices in the Mediterranean. And we will have also a very interesting panel discussion which will be moderated by Mr. Arnaud Bosc, and it will focus on the regeneration and biodiversity. So I will not take much of the time. I would like to ask Mr. Mark Pansoldo, who is a specialist on biodiversity representing EcoStack Innovations in Malta. And he will present the thematic paper Beyond Projects, Institutionalizing Biodiversity and Sustainable Tourism Practices in the Mediterranean. Mark?
Yeah.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today to launch the thematic paper focused on institutionalizing biodiversity and sustainable tourism practices in the Mediterranean. You know.
Give me a second.
Yeah, no problem. Great, thank you. Okay, so the Mediterranean is a biodiversity hotspot. So we have a rich array of ecosystems and species in the region. This ranges all the way from our marine ecosystems, so our rich Mediterranean seagrass meadows, for example, our coastal sand dunes, all the way up to the Mediterranean garrigue and our forests. It also stretches to our more anthropogenic landscapes, so including agricultural landscapes, vineyards, and olive groves. This rich variety of natural and also cultural heritage is what brings so many tourists to the Mediterranean every year. However, despite this, the presence of tourism can actually put quite a pressure on local ecosystems and actually lead to environmental degradation. This can occur perhaps due to land use change, so infrastructural development along the coastal area particularly. It might even be through direct degradation, so for example, tourists visiting sandy beaches and then the trampling of sand dunes. There are a variety of different ways in which tourists might negatively impact these kinds of precious ecosystems and the endemic species as well that we have in the Mediterranean. So the key thing here that's been developed within the cluster on nature and biodiversity is developing strategies and tools that transform tourism from a pressure actually to an opportunity for the conservation, even the restoration of Mediterranean biodiversity. So turning it into an enabler rather than a pressure. So the challenge that we addressed in the thematic paper, it wasn't focused on the fact that we need more tools or more strategies to facilitate sustainable tourism practices in the Mediterranean. The challenge we were addressing was actually how to embed these tools and strategies into long-term impact. We need to make sure that they're embedded in terms of governance frameworks, in terms of planning instruments as well. Because unfortunately, even though we have this vast array of interesting tools and strategies that are developed within the European projects, many of them remain within pilot implementation phases and don't have a long-lasting real-world impact despite their innovative approach. So here on this slide, you can see a few of the key roadblocks and barriers that might be preventing that shift from case studies and pilot implementation into long-term impact of the tools. There might be an issue, for example, of the lack of ownership or lack of coordination. So it could be that a tool or strategy is intended to sustainably manage tourism, but the key thing is that there's perhaps missing leadership from a particular public entity or from a particular stakeholder group. Perhaps there's a lack of coordination because different entities are conducting perhaps different activities in parallel. So there's an overlap or a duplication of efforts. There might also be a lack of meaningful engagement with local stakeholders as well. As we'll see further on in the presentation, stakeholders are very much key to understanding the natural and cultural assets that we have in our Mediterranean region. Therefore, engaging with stakeholders is highly important. It's also important to engage with them to show that this is not just a simply technocratic and top-down approach, but we want to actively co-create these strategies for a more sustainable and even regenerative tourism model in the Mediterranean. Another key barrier might be the lack of funding. So, as we'll see in the presentation, the development, for example, of online platforms or digital tools, if there's not sustainable funding long-term after the time frame of the project, these might not remain operable. Similarly with short-term political cycles, if there's a change in the political environment, it might also lead to shifts in priorities. So, for example, there might be a request for data collection about visitor flow or tourism hotspots, for example. That data is collected, but then there's a shift in the political environment, which then nothing is done with that data. So how do we embed these kind of innovative tools and strategies that are developed by the cluster and make sure they have a long-term impact and are embedded within these governance frameworks? So the tools and solutions that are developed by the cluster have basically been categorized into these 4 solution typologies. These correspond to their tourism management phases as well. So if, for example, I'm developing a tourism management strategy, these are the different tools and solutions I can use at certain phases of this strategy. It's also key, and we'll see a bit later why, that each of these tools and strategies that's developed within the cluster, they're not to be used in isolation, but to use an array of them to kind of mix and match and create a palette of different tools and solutions that can contribute to a sustainable tourism management strategy. So beginning with the first one, strategic planning and decision support tools. This basically identifies either the issue in terms of the spatial and temporal distribution, or also the assets that you have to hand. So for example, the tourism carrying capacity limit tool from 2KMed. This draws upon the natural and infrastructural thresholds that you have within a particular region. This helps to identify hotspots, perhaps where tourism is exceeding the carrying capacity of the area. Similarly, with the MedSky Tour, you have the Dark Sky Self-Assessment Guide. This allows, for example, policymakers or regional authorities to identify opportunities for a reduction in light pollution to enhance, for example, the possibilities of astrotourism and stargazing activities. So these tools here are really to try and explore the assets that we have and the issues that we have and go from there. Similarly with MedGears, for example, the strategy for sustainable agricultural tourism also identifies the heritage assets that we have in the landscape. So this really aims to identify either issues or assets we have and take it to the next step. This next step is then the governance implementation frameworks. So for example, here it's how can we turn these assets into something that's deliverable for tourism, or also respond to the crises that were identified in the first management phase. So for example, with 2KMed, You can take the stakeholder engagement and cooperation guidance, which guides stakeholders through how to respond and how to use the outputs of the tool. So the carrying capacity tool that I mentioned on the previous slide, I now have the results. I understand where the hotspots are, where the thresholds are being exceeded, and where tourism is creating too much of a pressure in those areas. I can then use this to understand, okay, how can I take this and do something actionable with it? How can I address this issue? Then we shift on to capacity building and knowledge transfer mechanisms. So as I mentioned before, it's key to engage with the local stakeholders. They know their territory very, very well, and perhaps they also have particular traditional practices associated with agriculture or land management practices. That is something that are very much marketable as experiences for tourists. So having this capacity building and knowledge transfer allows us to engage with these local stakeholders and understand what the territory has to offer. The joint training plan, for example, from MEDIAS, allows the training of local stakeholders for leveraging the GIAS recognition. So this is globally important agricultural heritage systems, how to leverage that recognition to create some marketable product for tourism. This is also very much adaptable to the local context, so you can draw upon country-specific case studies adapted to the local language as well. The community heritage hubs, for example, from EcoC routes, allow us to engage with the local community to really draw upon the natural and cultural assets that can then be presented as tourism opportunities, so integrated into touristic itineraries. So basically what we've done here is we've gone through each of the different management phases. We've identified either the assets or the issues we're trying to address in our territory. We've gone to how can we do something actionable with this and address this issue or maximize the utilization of these assets for tourism. Then we've moved on to the engagement of stakeholders and capacity building. And now we've reached the stage where, okay, we want to create something that's market-facing, something that interacts directly with the tourists. So for example, from the MEDGIAS project, we have this catalogue of sustainable agro-tourism experiences. This is for eco-conscious travelers, for example, who are interested in these kinds of agro-tourism experiences. For EcoC routes, these are eco-nautical itineraries. So these connect up, for example, marine, coastal, and inland routes. Similarly, we have the online platform from Port Crew. So this, for example, if you have cruise passengers arriving at port, they can use this platform and understand what kinds of natural and cultural assets are available, exhibitions and events that are going on in the local area. So these are really the kind of front-facing, tourist-facing products. So as I mentioned earlier, the key is not to use each of these tools or strategies in isolation, but to take them as a palette and to mix and match them. So for example here, say I wanted to create a sustainable tourism management strategy for coastal areas and islands. These are a particular variety of tools I can draw upon. Obviously, it's not limited to this. Like I said, I can mix and match. So here, for example, I can use the tourism carrying capacity tool. And here I can identify, okay, in my coastal area or my island, where are particular thresholds being exceeded in terms of the carrying capacity, in terms of the infrastructure, and also the natural assets, in terms of environmental degradation, for example. I've now identified my visitation hotspots. So I can use the stakeholder engagement and cooperation guidance to turn that into something actionable. Okay, now I have the outputs from the tool. What can I do about this? How can I address this issue? Then, for example, I can utilize the Med-wide eco-nautical itineraries. So let's say I have a lot of concentrated tourism in the coastal area. These itineraries seek to spatially redistribute tourists across the territory. So by advertising, for example, tourism experiences which are further inland, these may be associated with agro-tourism, for example, astrotourism. How can we connect up these itineraries? And we can draw upon the community heritage hubs, for example. So we draw upon these community heritage hubs to identify key tourism experiences that can draw, for example, tourists further inland and spatially redistribute them, alleviating some of that pressure off the coastal zone. And similarly, we can communicate these to the Port Crew, through the Port Crew online platform. We can communicate all of these offerings to tourists using the platform. So when they arrive at port, for example, they're aware of, oh, these are all the different tourist experiences that are available, not only in the coastal zone, but also further inland. Just as another example as well, this is focused more on rural agro-tourism and the diversification of the landscape in terms of the tourism offerings. So similarly here, I could use some of the tools as I showed on the previous slide. So for example, the tourism carrying capacity limit tool, I can also use that here. The idea is obviously not to shift all of the environmental degradation and the tourism pressure from the coast and simply move it inland. So easily, I could implement the tourism carrying capacity limit tool here as well to understand where the thresholds lie in terms of the natural assets and the infrastructure to avoid causing the same kind of environmental degradation that, for example, is happening along the coast. Similarly, I can see I can use the community heritage hubs to draw upon these local assets, natural or cultural, and how we can sell these kinds of products as well, or these kinds of experiences to tourists. These tourists can then be made aware of these different offerings as well through the joint catalogue from MedGuias, for example, which then disseminates these ideas of different tourist experiences and itineraries that can be accessed. We can even draw upon, for example, the Inspire project, which focused more on gastronomic heritage. So, for example, in a rural zone here, you can focus on the aspects of agrobiodiversity, traditional agricultural practices, gastronomy, and, for example, even from MedSky Tour, we can use their Dark Sky self-assessment guide for regional authorities, for example, to identify where there are opportunities to enhance or create dark sky reserves by reducing light pollution and diversifying into astrotourism, stargazing activities. So this is just to show you that this is a palette that we can arrange and rearrange and mix and match depending on our objectives in terms of a sustainable tourism management strategy. So as I mentioned before, the key challenge here is not that we need to design more tools or more strategies necessarily. The key is we have a lot of innovative tools and strategies that can be used to facilitate sustainable and even regenerative tourism. But how do we embed these in governance frameworks and make sure that they last beyond their project timeframes? So here we have a few key replicating factors or enablers, let's say, that would allow the replication and scalability of these tools and strategies across the Mediterranean. So as I mentioned before, it's key to engage with the local stakeholders. As we saw with the management phase focused on capacity building and local training, it's key to engage with local stakeholders, because otherwise it might just be seen as something technocratic, and you might even meet local resistance as well in terms of some tourism management strategies. Equally, you need strong governance frameworks to avoid the issues, as I mentioned earlier, of a lack of coordination, a lack of ownership, where you might have a tool that's been implemented, but no one's really taking leadership there, and eventually the momentum dies. You also need targeted capacity building and context-specific training, as was mentioned before as well with the MedGuias training plan. This is something that's key to be adapted to the local context. So it's key to make sure that these kinds of methodologies and strategies are flexible in their adaptation. It's also key to have reliable data systems and monitoring capabilities. For example, the Port Crew online platform and also the tourism carrying capacity tool. We have a lot of data coming into these platforms and tools. However, we need to make sure that this fragmented data we constantly have access to, it can constantly be integrated, and you have an iterative process to improve it over time. So you need to make sure that you have reliable data inflows over time. You also need cross-sectoral and cross-regional coordination. For example, with the eco-nautical routes as well. We're talking about routes across several territories or provinces or even countries. So we need this kind of coordination. And also it is very much key to having all of these experiences and products available to tourists communicated through promotional strategies. Because even if we're creating a sustainable tourism management strategy, we've embedded them in a governance framework, we've got the funding. If they're not being utilized by tourists, they're not helping to redistribute, for example, the tourism flows. So we're still remaining with these tourism hotspots along the coast, continuing to degrade ecosystems. So it's key that communication and promotional strategies are carried out with tourists. And then, of course, the sustainable funding models, as well as I mentioned before, it's key to have long-term operability, especially in the case of, for example, digital platforms. So if you'd like to check out the thematic paper, you can scan the QR code here. And there it goes into more depth as well about the different topics that I've covered today. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for this very interesting presentation.